So welcome to our first of the year, of the school year Manzanita Speaker Series event, and I'm grateful to have a chance to get up and talk about some of the swirlings, and I want to call it that because the ideas that have really born Manzanita are actually like a living organism. They're growing, and the form is not entirely known yet, so I really feel like we're still in our infancy, and a lot of beautiful form is taking shape. And I have this amazing opportunity to, as a head of school and as a teacher, to take ideas that seem really critical and relevant to young people and to allow our school's curriculum to embody them. And it's super exciting, and also it's a little daunting because, for a couple of reasons. One is challenging paradigms that are out there. A lot of cultural paradigms take a tremendous amount of time and commitment and risk among human beings to shift. Paradigms don't just shift magically. They shift through commitment and effort. And so that bit of it's scary. And then also the ideas continue to emerge as we learn more and more about Earth system science and the Great Turning and the News Story. Those are our three curricular areas. And the content just gets richer and more vital and intriguing. So it's a little daunting to watch it unfold and to know that it's kind of like riding a wild animal and you're not quite sure what kind of animal it is. But it's a beautiful thing, and I'm really grateful that I get to be part of Manzanita. I want to talk about something that I think is really transforming the face of human learning, human knowledge, and it's systems theory. And I don't even really want to call it theory. It's the understanding of how our world is comprised of systems, not so much discrete entities that interact and intermingle, but actually really complex and rich and nuanced systems that are interwoven. And there's a beautiful body of literature that's growing in this area, and it's challenging long-held paradigms of the scientific worldview that's about a mechanistic world. It's being challenged from all different directions, this mechanistic worldview. I'm going to talk a little bit about that too. So I wanted to just let you know that my presentation is really, it's kind of a, I'm a jazz pianist as well. I don't even want to say jazz because I don't really play jazz anymore. I improvise extemporaneously instead of playing jazz, which is an improvisation over form. I actually improvise form. That's the way I play piano now. And it's really hard to get gigs. Partly because, there's very few musicians who want to do that together. And you have to have absolute silence to do it. It takes a huge amount of concentration. So it's hard to do publicly, although I have on occasion. But I have 3 recordings that are all extemporaneous, 1 solo and 2 duo recordings. I'm not here to pitch my music. But I'm telling you that because I find that the more I dig into this content, the more I find myself like wanting to improvise small little selections. And so part of the way I'm conceptualizing tonight is to talk about a number of different things that I really believe weave together. So maybe that's a disclaimer, or maybe it's just the form of my night. So I'm going to start by telling you a couple stories about tracking. Human beings have for a very long time, and you can hear me say that if you hang out with me at all, you know I talk about human beings doing something for a very long time and then not doing it anymore. And one of the ones that we did for nodding heads over there, my student. Tracking is this human art form that is about being able to know where the animal is or which direction it might have gone by a combination of reading the track and also feeling the animal. And I know there's a piece there that's a little intriguing, right? The feeling the animal piece. But I'll share with you 3 stories. There's a wonderful book called Dersu the Trapper. It was made into a film in the 50s, but it's the account of a Russian geographer who was out in these really rugged mountains of Russia in the late 1800s, and he was on a mapping expedition, and he encountered a trapper, a fur trapper named Dersu, who was the last of his tribe. An indigenous man who was the last of his tribe, and he'd become a trapper. So he lived by animal fur gathering and selling. And he encounters this man out in the wilderness, and for the next several years, this man's his guide. And there's tigers up there. So at one point in the book, I remember Dersu and he are walking, and they see a tiger track. And they're walking around the track, and they're starting to talk about, and they have a rifle, but, it's a rifle from the 1800s, and they're single load, and this is a giant 800-pound animal that eats humans. And so there's this conversation about the risk and the danger of being around these tigers. And at one point, Dersu says he can feel the hair on his neck stand. And he turns to his comrade, the geographer, and says, "The tiger has just walked across my track." So he turns around and he begins to speak into the darkness and says, "We are here and we mean you no harm. like that. And it's this communication, and so there's lots of layers to it. There's the animal communication piece. But the part that struck me was he begins to explain that the track is the thread of your being through time. And that the tracks that intersect each other feel each other with the right sensitivity and intuition. And when you begin to look at the San Bushmen, who are gifted trackers, they track intuitively. They don't always see the track. And they always track, and they jog when they track. They're persistence hunters. They actually run animals to exhaustion, which is an old human art form. Our actual morphology, our bipedalism has two components. It has walking, which is a pendulous swinging of the legs, completely morphologically different than running, which is both feet off the ground. And those evolved separately. So we used to think running was a sort of an extended form of walking. It's a completely different morphology, which evolved in humans to track and chase down animals. So before we had projectile points we could fire in the distance, we would run animals to exhaustion. It's called persistence hunting. It's practiced in northern Mexico, and the San Bushmen still do it. And for us to have evolved and grown these massive brains that we have over 3 million years, we had to eat a lot of protein. And we did that by hunting meat animals, and we did it by running them into exhaustion, which is why humans can run farther than any animal on the earth with training, believe it or not. We have the greatest endurance of any mammal, horses and dogs as well. So we have a person in here training to run a 100-mile race. Claire, raise your hand. There's no other animal that can run 100 miles. So anyway, got off on a tangent. Welcome to my world. Okay, but I wanted to say tracking is this amazing thing that involves intuition. And the last piece, after I mentioned the San Bushmen, I want to mention my friend John Young, who has a beautiful audio CD on tracking. And he says he doesn't like to talk about it, but he talks about it on this one recording, and he says he was doing a practice called peripheral vision, which is something we don't do a lot, right? How often are you asked to pay attention to what's going on in the periphery of your vision? If you live in nature, if you are an indigenous person, you don't pay attention to your periphery. You either starve or you get eaten. So it's a skill that we have lost. But when he began to practice over a long period of time, watching his periphery, paying attention to this, but also watching the periphery. Hope, did you have a question? Eat or get eaten? You're wondering. Did that one get your attention? Yes.
You said we needed an LA for driving.
Believe it or not, people should be more defensive, and they should watch their periphery. Defensive driving is watching your periphery.
I'm wondering if people in Los Angeles have better peripheral vision than the rest of the country.
In places that don't have traffic lights or street line markers, people watch their peripheral vision a lot more. There's a lot of countries that don't take care of you as well as we do here. So, defensive driving, really a good one. In this recording, John Young talks about practicing tracking, and then one day seeing in his peripheral vision these little silver lines. And he was an undergraduate student in anthropology at the time, and it shifted his whole. But he ended up following these silver lines that he could see only in his periphery, and they came upon the deer that he had been tracking. So he began to study tracking in indigenous cultures, and almost every really accomplished tracker talked about the silver line to the animal. So just an idea and a thought. And I'm going to track it back to this conversation of systems by sharing with you something of Einstein's later years. He actually, towards the end of his life, I'm quoting a physicist, Albert Einstein concluded his later years stating that past, present, and future all exist simultaneously. Now, there was a lot of things Einstein said. He talked about the expanding universe, he talked about matter and energy, he talked about gravity, made a lot of huge contributions to science. But he also said, in his conception of the dimensions of space-time, that time existed simultaneously, past, present, and future, and that they're disaggregated by humans because we can't construct it any other way. I don't go to the metaphysical stuff. It doesn't really capture my attention because it's an endless quagmire. But I was intrigued by that because I was trying to connect it back to tracking and this idea that that tiger crossed my track and I felt it. And so just a thing to think about, and I'm going to end that idea there. And I want to just talk a little bit about some places that systems thinking has really aided us in the work that we do in the world, we human beings. So my undergraduate, my master's degree is in medical anthropology, which is the study of how to deliver healthcare to people who have very subtle belief systems. Because for a long time, the idea was that you could just go teach people how to take better care of themselves, and they would do it without any sort of respect for their native ways of thinking and being. And one of the classic stories was a water purification project in the Andean mountains. A woman got a 2-year grant to purify water, to teach people how to boil water, because the farmers were contaminating the water supply with their cattle, and these indigenous communities were drinking the water downstream. getting really bad parasitic infections, and kids were dying of dehydration. So she went from village to village. She went to 28 villages and taught primarily the women who were doing a lot of the cooking to boil water. And they were all very respectful, and these Quechua-speaking native Indians were thanking her. And she came back a year later, and she was measuring, how had the incidence of parasitic infection gone down, and she found that it hadn't changed at all, and that they weren't boiling the water. So she starts asking, this is in the 1960s, she starts asking them, it was a UNICEF-funded program, and she starts asking, trying to investigate a little more deeply, and she finds out that they believe that the spirit of the water is lost when you boil the water. So water carries a spirit essence, and when you boil it, the spirit leaves the water. So they didn't want the spirit to leave the water, so they didn't boil it. But she never asked them what they thought about water. So her time and energy had been sort of wasted, except it's a great example of bad anthropology or bad healthcare delivery. And then the other little story is a Guatemalan village, a little later in the story. This was in the 80s. An anthropologist had a grant, and at the end of his grant period, he had about $2,800 left, and he was trying to figure out what to do with it. He wanted to spend it, so he went to the villagers, and he said, I got $2,800. So he was taking a little different approach, saying, what do you guys need? And they all got together, the men's and women's councils got together, and they came to him, and they said, pretty poor village, sharecropping mostly, and they came and they said, we want lights for the soccer field. So he's like, no worries, whatever you need. So he spent the money, and they built lights for the soccer field. So here's what happened, though. So the men loved soccer, and they would come home after work. They'd leave work early, actually, and go play soccer. And then they'd go, when it got dark, they'd go drinking. And then they'd get up late. That was their story. And the women felt like, well, if we get soccer lights, they'll work later. They'll come home and play soccer till they're exhausted, go to bed, and they won't drink as much, and they'll get up earlier. And that's what happened. So it was a win-win. The men worked more, they made more money, they didn't drink as much, and, healthier village. But they knew that. So the idea here is the assumption that the outsider knows what the poor person or the third world community needs is, again, a reflection of a long kind of paternalistic approach to human relationship, but it also points to systems. That there's a lot of complex systems going on in any community, and they merit investigation. So with those little stories, I'm going to show a little video to you. So that's a project to increase education for girls in underdeveloped countries. It's called the Girl Effect, and there's different people working on it. But ties into this idea that you affect one little piece of a community or a culture or a system, and it has global impact, potentially. So I wanted to share that little video with you. And I wanted to ask you guys to have a partner somewhere where you're sitting, maybe, someone you can speak to for the next 3 or 4 minutes. So just pick that person. You got that person? Somebody you came with, maybe? And now I want you to pick any object in the room, okay? And it could be a human, it could be a clock, a light, this thing, the screen, it doesn't matter, any object, but a physical object in the room. And then see if you and the person you're sitting with can come up with, and one of you can count, and see how many things you can determine that it's connected to, systems that it's part of. And if you want, just by way of example, if I take this piece of paper, it's connected to deforestation, it's connected to wood, it's connected to the economy of literacy, it's connected to ink, the production of ink, the delivery, the staple, the machine that photocopied it, the electricity in the machine that photocopied. It's like you can just keep going, but I want you to take that little practice and pick something in the room and go ahead and take a minute and see how many things you can come up with that it's connected to. Does anybody want to share an example of a rather counterintuitive connection that you made to something you were talking about, like where, I didn't think it was going to be connected to that? By way of association, our staff did this at a staff meeting, and we were sitting there, and there was a pineapple on the table. We went into a whole conversation about pineapple and what it was threaded to in United Fruit in Guatemala in the 1950s, and we were trying to decide if it was still connected to an oppressive, foreign multinational fruit company because the pineapple cost 85 cents and they had profit associated with it. We were getting into some really intricate debate, and it was kind of intense. And I will never, by the way, ever experience pineapple the same way again. So now I have a relationship to pineapple, a system relationship to pineapple based on that. But were you pointing at Martina, Grace?
I was saying that our class also did something.
Oh, yes, we did, indeed, with a piece of wood, right?
Manzanita.
And it had some wood burning writing on it. Does anybody have just an example of something? Yeah, Bob.
We were talking about this lamp. Okay, so this lamp is connected to electricity. So electricity's got to come from a power plant of some sort, or distribution first. It has to be a power plant, probably a dam. The dam is connected to a river. The river is connected to the snowpack. Snowpack's connected to the weather, the atmosphere. It's all affected by the sun. This is part of the universe. And that's going that way.
Yeah.
Coming this way, the light's coming to us. So it's affecting us and everybody in the room. It's affecting our ability to probably communicate. We can have the light to read, to see each other. So going that way, it's kind of infinite, because everybody that we are connected to, and right now, has something to do with that lamp.
Yeah, that one's a good one. It's connected to a lot of things, like the insect world and art, and Zev Yaroslavsky, because he helped build this library. And, you can keep going and going. Welding.
The metal, the glass.
Yeah, there's
the dye.
the colors. Yeah, it's and it keeps going like that. And whoever made it in their life is connected to that. It gets pretty rich, and that's just sort of the surface of it. The more I tangle with this way of being and thinking, it really alters in a very interesting and healthy and powerful way my experience of everything. And I'm noticing the more I study systems thinkers, I recognize sort of a kind of collegiality with them, because they are also beginning to see things very differently, and it's extremely powerful, and it's an antidote to a lot of challenges that we're facing. I'm going to show you another short video.
A Sufi story tells of a village of blind men. One day, a new creature arrived. Each of the blind men grasped one part of it and declared that they knew what it was. A snake? A rug? Columns? But, by only experiencing one part of it, each was wrong. In our everyday lives, we also tend to look at things in parts, rather than experiencing the world as a whole. This is not surprising, as such divisions start early on in school, where we are divided into a range of subjects. Yet, the world is much more complex, and if we are to understand its complexity, we need to think about the greater picture. We have to think in systems.
In the 1950s, the Dayak people of Borneo, an island in Southeast Asia, were suffering from an outbreak of malaria, so they called the World Health Organization for help. The World Health Organization had a ready-made solution, which was to spray copious amounts of DDT around the island. With the application of DDT, the mosquitoes that carried the malaria were knocked down, and so was the malaria. There were some interesting side effects, though. The first was that the roofs of people's houses began to collapse on their heads. Turns out the DDT not only killed off the malaria-carrying mosquitoes, but it also killed a species of parasitic wasp that had controlled a population of thatch-eating caterpillars. Thatch being what the roofs of the Dayak people's homes were made from. Without the wasps, the caterpillars multiplied and flourished and began munching their way through the villagers' roofs. That was just the beginning. The DDT affected a lot of the island's other insects, which were eaten by the resident population of small lizards called geckos. The biological half-life of DDT is around 8 years, so animals like geckos do not metabolize it very fast. It stays in their system for a long time. Over time, the geckos began to accumulate pretty high levels of DDT, and while they tolerated the DDT fairly well, the island's resident cats, which dined on the geckos, did not. The cats ate the geckos, and the DDT contained in the geckos killed the cats. With the cats gone, the island's population of rats came out to play. We all know what happens when rats multiply and flourish. Pretty soon the Dayak people were back on the phone to the World Health Organization, only this time it wasn't malaria that was the problem. It was the plague and the destruction of their grain stores, both of which were caused by the overpopulation of rats. This time, though, the World Health Organization didn't have a ready-made solution and had to invent one. What did they do? They decided to parachute live cats into Borneo. Operation Cat Drop occurred courtesy of the Royal Air Force and eventually stabilized the situation.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about science. I want you to imagine the world up until Nicholas Copernicus and Galileo, and that we're talking 1500s to 1600s. And for some reason, somebody decided that the 1500s was the 16th century, and the 1600s were the 17th century. So some of us still get confused by that. But just know, I'm going to say 1500s and 1600s, because we're living in the 21st century. I was born in the 20th century, 1961. It's confusing a little bit. Okay. In Greece, they say you're in your, like if you turn 12, you're in your 13th year. Because you finished 12. Now you're in your 13th year. How old are you, Benjamin?
I'm in my 17th year.
Very good. Well done. So imagine that up until the time of Galileo and Copernicus, and I'll tell you why they're important. You know, most of the scientists, they were called natural philosophers largely, but they were rigorous scientists, mathematicians and geographers and geologists and chemists, and these were, and many of them were polymaths, which is a term that means that they were literate in a number of sciences. And they were also often very much into mysticism. And because at that time, the idea was if you just study nature, you're going to discover the mind of God, because the mind of God is in nature. So they call these natural philosophers. So a bunch of things happened right around the 15th, 16th century, just sort of prior to the Industrial Revolution, which was an outcome of these scientific discoveries. But one of the things that happened was Copernicus, right towards the end of his life, made a public announcement that all of his mathematical applications, all these laws of science that he understood, had demonstrated to him a earth-shattering, he discovered something that really shook the universe of primarily the church and also a lot of the intellectuals in the scientific community. But he said, based on all his mathematical calculations, it really appears to be that the earth is not the center of the universe. It actually appears to be the sun. And we're actually going around the sun. And that shocked people. And for quite a while, it was sort of dismissed until Galileo came along, a little less than 100 years later, and had developed a telescope, and also math had sort of evolved a little bit. And he offered definitive proof that, in fact, yeah, it's actually true. What Copernicus said is true. The sun is the center. We're going around the sun. And it really unsettled people. But it also opened up the possibility that the sciences, that mathematics, could begin to explain things in ways that we had never imagined. And also, right around this time, bubonic plague struck Europe, right? So imagine like a third to a half of the population dying from the plague. So something happened in both science and religion. What happened in religion at the time was people began to focus on redemptive religious traditions. So redemption is the idea that if you just live a really good life and you follow a lot of these prescriptions, you'll have an afterlife where everything will be cool. Because clearly down here it's not very good. I mean, look at all the people that died. I mean, it's really rough down here. This is a really sinful, awful place, obviously, right? I mean, gosh, a third of my family's dead. Half my village died. So religion became focused on this sort of redemption, and the sciences began to look at disaggregating all the laws of the universe and began to make discoveries that really advanced our abilities to control and regulate and predict. So like the forces of attraction and gravitational things would be predicted, and this just flourished. And it sort of culminated with Descartes. And the Cartesian worldview comes out of the word Descartes. Descartes was a brilliant, we all know him as the one who said, I think, therefore I am. But what he really said was, look, the entire universe is a machine. God set into motion all the particles and all the beings and the bodies, and they're all following laws of motion. And it's all a massive machine. And it's a really well-constructed machine. And what makes us different, though, in case you wanted to know, and he declared this, what makes human beings different is we have soul. God gave us soul. So we are different than all the other. So he actually did some really gruesome things to make his point, including dissecting animals live and telling his students, you need to ignore the screams of this dog that we're dissecting because that's just a machine running down. And he actually, it's horrific stuff, yet he was trying to demonstrate that the human being had soul. Okay, so this became the theme that pushed science in a direction of control of almost everything. And I want to say that was supported by the large religious traditions of the time. So I'm taking this out of the Hebrew Bible, the book of Genesis 1:26, the Christian Old Testament. This is a little support for the control of nature. I know most of you have heard this quote. Let us make mankind in our image and our likeness so that he may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So it's basically, the mandate was we're in charge, we're in control, we can do what we want. And I don't think there was any vicious intent, but it was just an experience of massive discoveries through these applications of scientific laws, physics and chemistry and biology all flourishing and leading to great, tremendous discoveries with the idea that if we just keep going, we're going to solve all of our problems and everything's going to be good. And I think that whole worldview began to come apart for a lot of reasons. And one of the big ones was, it was a kind of combination of things, but I think our recognition that our impact on the environment was actually going to end up hurting us made us really reconsider this industrial revolution, the scientific revolution. It began to have us in the middle of the 20th century, 1950s and 60s, we began to really take a different approach. I think in this very room I quoted Aldo Leopold, who was a land manager, worked for the Fish and Game Service, and he would shoot wolves. And he had this epiphany after shooting a wolf and watching it die under his hand, looking into its green eyes. And he has this lyrical description that he wrote in a very short book called A Sand County Almanac, which was like a Bible for early environmentalists, written in 1949. He said, I could feel with my hand not just the wolf, but I could feel into the mountain upon which the wolf was bleeding out its last and breathing its last breath. And I felt that the entire ecosystem was weeping in grief at this moment. And it was this real epiphanous moment for him that he wrote about lyrically in the Sand County Almanac, which I invite all of you to look at if you want to know a little about the history of the environmental movement. However, that was the beginning, and Rachel Carson, of course, really pushed that along in the early 60s with her testimony and her writing. And we began to question whether this worldview actually was sound, that if we just have enough progress, we're all going to be okay. We'll have freedom from toil, and we'll have all our diseases cured, and happiness will reign across the face of the earth. And we all have a deep intuition that that's not so. And that leads me into a little bit of a different story that I'm not going to go into, but it's the story of our third trimester, which is how do we construct a cosmology as a culture that's lacking a good story at this point. We don't have a story that really settles in our gut, and we say, yeah, that's where we're from, and that's who we are, and that's where we're going. but it's out there, and a lot of us are beginning to piece it together. And it's an exciting and it's a really cool story. So I feel really good about that. But I did want to say that this mechanistic worldview has really come under scrutiny. And one of the great contributions to its dismantling came through the work of James Lovelock, one of the better-known scientists who's really begun to embody a systems understanding. For those of you that don't know, he was something of a rebel chemist. He's a British man. He's still alive. He's in his mid-90s. And he created his own laboratory, made all his own inventions. And one of his inventions was a very small device that could detect with a tremendous sensitivity the presence of atoms, particular atoms and molecules. And he was walking outside where he lived in the rural countryside of England, and he noticed this haze. And he says, that haze wasn't there when I was a child. I grew up in this county. What is that haze caused by? Is it caused by humans? Because the city's getting bigger down there, and there's more factories. And the one thing that would tell me if it is human-made is if I can find fluorocarbons, because they're human-made. It's the only place they can exist is as a byproduct of human activity. So he put his little detector out there, and he detected these fluorocarbons. So then one day it was very clear, and he went out there to double check that there was no fluorocarbons, and there were still fluorocarbons there. And then he started wondering, are they there even when there's no... So he went to northern England, and he checked, and he found fluorocarbons, and then he got on a freighter, and he went all the way to Antarctica, and he measured fluorocarbons, and he wrote a very short paper saying that fluorocarbons were in the entire atmosphere. And then a couple of North American scientists, a geophysicist and an atmospheric scientist, wrote a paper, they sort of declared that it was going to destroy the ozone layer, these fluorocarbons, and that it would destroy the Earth. And they both got the Nobel Prize in chemistry. But James Lovelock is a really remarkable guy. He was invited by NASA to try to find life on Mars. So his second huge discovery after this little device, which would have been a significant achievement for any scientist, he didn't stop there. And he was invited by NASA, and he was working at JPL, and they were trying to find life on Mars. And he was working with people like Carl Sagan, and he was saying, we don't have to go to Mars. Everybody wanted to try to figure out how to get to Mars to see if there's anything living there. He said, we can figure out if there's life on Mars by looking at the atmosphere. And if the atmosphere is stable gases, then we know it's probably no life on Mars, because on Earth, our atmosphere is really unstable. It has it's got like methane in it, and it's got oxygen, it's got really high contents of very unstable gases that are being produced by living organisms, because that's where our waste products go, and that's where so he said, just look at the atmosphere, and he made this declaration. And so I'm going to share with you a couple videos of his aha moment, and also what he discovered really fundamentally that has changed the way we think is James Lovelock discovered that the biosphere, the living systems of the Earth, we've got a geosphere, that's the rocks, and the hydrosphere is all the water, and the atmosphere we all know. We have an ethnosphere, that's another thing. But that the biosphere is actually actively regulating everything else. And he discovered this, and it's an epiphany. And I wanted to share with you a couple clips from a beautiful documentary called A Brilliant Mind. We showed it last year, but I just want to show you a couple clips from it, a couple minutes long each. So first one is his eureka moment, and the second one is about algae in the oceans and how that is an example of what we call biotic regulation. So this is, it started out being called Gaia theory, and now it's more properly referred to as Earth systems science, and it is a very reputable field of study, and it's based on systems theory. So I want to share with you a little bit of James Lovelock.
What this analysis showed was that Mars had atmospheres that were almost nothing but carbon dioxide, just bare traces of other gases present. And I knew immediately this meant Mars was probably lifeless. At that moment, suddenly a thought came into my mind, but why is the Earth's atmosphere so amazingly different?
It was this realization, and the logic that provided it, that prompted Lovelock to think about our own planet in a radically different way.
The Earth was a remarkable planet. How does it stay always habitable? All the billions of years. We've got oxygen mixed with methane that would be explosive if it were different in composition. And then it occurred to me that both gases were made by living organisms at the Earth's surface. If they were making them, maybe they were regulating them. It was a eureka moment. I sort of blurted this all out, that, oh, the Earth must be a great self-regulating system, almost alive, that's holding its atmosphere constant. And this shook the others, particularly Carl. He said, oh, you couldn't possibly be right, Jim. And then he thought for a moment. He said, but there might be something in what you say, because we astronomers have known that one of the great puzzles is that the sun has warmed up 30% since the Earth formed. So if it was warm enough for life to start, why aren't we boiling now? And then immediately it occurred to me, well, if the organisms can regulate the amount of gas in the atmosphere, then they can regulate the temperature. We know it. We've only put 6% more CO2 in the atmosphere, and we're all in trouble already. It doesn't take much to change the temperature by changing the gases. It was life that looked after the atmosphere and the climate. After I formulated Gaia, the evidence for it began gradually to emerge. To give an example, the production by organisms that live in the ocean of a strange gas called dimethyl sulfide. What happens is, if the ocean surface water gets warm, the algae grow better. It's like the growth of all organisms. It's faster when it's warmer. And as they grow better, they produce more of the gas, dimethyl sulfide, which vents into the atmosphere and ultimately causes a cloud layer to form over the ocean surface. And clouds are white and they reflect sunlight back to space, and so the more the algae grow, the cooler the Earth gets. Why should the algae want to do that? Well, the reason is they have a need to keep the ocean surface waters cool, because once the ocean surface water rises above about 14 degrees Celsius, it stratifies, and then the nutrients that are in the lower water cannot enter that top layer, and so the algae living there die of lack of food, quite simply. So they have a strong vested interest in doing anything that will stop the top layer of water from rising above 14 Celsius. So you've got a nice thermostated mechanism there. And the whole thing's beautifully stable. So there was one of the great natural cycles at last explained properly.
James Lovelock introduced Gaia theory, and he actually was kind of ostracized from the scientific community for quite a while. And because there's an implication there, and I'll show a little clip a little later, where you're suggesting that the organisms are somehow collaborating and conspiring together to maintain all these systems of the planet. And it implies some sort of collective intelligence. A lot of people in sort of fringe New Age movements were, or back then it was the hippie movement, were saying, you know, this is our blessed Mother Earth. And they were, without the scientific component, they were sort of besmirching his name because he felt that they weren't able to represent it in a way. So he was ostracized from the scientific community, and he created some very significant scientific models, including this one called Daisy World that you can look into. But eventually, he was then sort of integrated into the scientific community. I want to talk a little bit about, a little specifically about systems theory, and if you can bear with me for maybe 5 or 10 minutes, I'm going to dig into some of the really important pieces of systems theory, because there's one in particular that really challenges our traditional understanding of the way the world works. So systems theory is the understanding of living systems as having very specific definable qualities. One of the defining qualities of a living system is that it's able to self-regulate. So, for example, when it gets kind of warm in here, you might actually unzip your jacket a little bit, or you might fan yourself, or you might perspire. That's your organism without your mind necessarily being involved, allowing yourself to cool down. But organisms self-regulate in response to changes in the external conditions of their, and that's true of also the organs in your body. And I would actually want to say that the individual organs in your body act like living systems themselves. The cells in your body behave like living systems in the same way. Your organs and your cells all self-regulate. They also have another quality of a living system in that information, matter, and energy move freely in and out of the system. So information is moving into your system potentially tonight, and information might be coming out at some point as you have conversations. Energy moves in and out of your body as well on a regular basis. So you're a living system. You have those qualities. You also self-regulate. A really interesting feature of systems is that individual components themselves have all of these qualities. So all the way down to the atom acts as a self-contained system, moving up to the molecule behaves as a self-contained system. And these separate systems, they call them holons, they're nested in one another. And you are nested in a family, in a community, in a biome, in a biosphere, in an ecological system on a planet. So the idea in systems theory is that each individual system has integrity in itself, it self-regulates, and it expands outward through these nested hierarchies. So those are all very easy to understand. There's one other that's really intriguing, and it's that when you bring together two separate complete systems and they form something new, what they form could not be predicted from the parts alone. They call that emergence, an emergent property. So, for example, if you were to study just the cells in my heart, or the cells, you could look at them all, and in my own sort of development as a fetus, at some point, there's enough cells and they're starting to form these chambers, and all of a sudden this thing starts pumping. All of a sudden it's a heart. That's an emergent property. Another way to look at it is you take hydrogen and oxygen separately as actual molecules, as elements on the periodic table. You can't predict from looking at them for your whole life that if you put them together you get water. That's called an emergent property. And within systems, as they get more complex, things emerge from them. You can have emergence when two people get together with their musical instruments and something comes from the two of them that didn't exist separately and couldn't be produced separately. That's called emergence. And that's interesting to think about because our universe, since the discoveries of Einstein, when originally thought the universe was static and it was just in place, right? But he discovered that it was an expansion, and it's actually it's an emergence. So this particular talk tonight is an emergent property. It hasn't happened before. Your reactions to it and how it engages you in your life, those are emergence, and that's happening in life all the time because life continually gets more complex. That takes me to the last piece of systems, is that they seem to evolve in complexity. They don't seem to, they do. But the piece that really challenges our typical notions about it and the mechanistic worldview of Darwin was that, look, over time, systems get more complex because they randomly mutate their genes. And if the gene that mutates is adaptive, like if I'm a deer and I'm a little short deer, and the weather changes and all the branches come down lower on the trees, all the big deer get their horns caught, but I'm not going to survive because I have this mutation and I can carry on and pass on my gene. And that's just random. So the Darwin's idea of natural selection was it involved random mutations of genes. We don't have any other explanation for how evolution happens, at least not collectively talking about. But what systems is saying, systems theory, is that there seems to be something inherent in matter that has it self-organizing and that has it creatively problem-solving. So that's a really interesting idea. Matter is acting to become more complex, and when problems appear, matter somehow manages to solve problems. So it's a real tweak, and it implies a lot of things that is very challenging to people, because it's suggesting, for example, that all of the algae in the ocean have gotten together and said, look guys, if it gets too warm, the nutrients are going to not come to the surface and we're going to starve. So let's release a gas that will allow water molecules to form to create a cloud cover. I mean, that's sort of what it implies. And that's a big challenging idea, that there's some sort of collective intelligence at work. And I'm not suggesting that. It really kind of intimidates people who have a very strong feeling that those are spiritual matters or that's religion. And I'm just going to suggest we are in an amazing time where these ideas and these notions and these discoveries are challenging our paradigms across the board. I mean, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of dark matter. You ever heard of that? Does anybody know, okay, all the visible matter of the universe and all the known energy in the universe, does anybody know how much of the universe that actually comprises? Anybody know that statistic off the top of up until very recently, everybody assumed that what was visible was all that there was. What was immeasurable is all that there is. Understanding that dark holes absorb light, but we're not talking about dark holes. They now believe, this is like to the thousandth of a percent, and there's no debate about this, that the observable physical world, the physical matter of the entire universe that you can see with the Hubble telescope, and all the energy we can calculate to be present in the universe, actually represents 5% of the matter and energy in the universe. And the reason they say that is because when they're looking now with the Hubble telescope and these precise instruments at the way objects in space are moving, there is much more mass in the universe than you can't account for the movements based on what is predicted. What's predicted would be very different from what they're seeing. So they are now saying, well, there's an energy and a mass in the universe that we cannot see. So I'm sharing that only to say that and hundreds of other discoveries in the last 100 years are so shattering the foundations of science. I want to introduce you to somebody. If you don't know Rupert Sheldrake, he wrote a book in 1982 called A New Theory of Life. And it was heralded by the editor of Science magazine, one of the top science magazines. He said, there has not for years been a better candidate for book burning than Rupert Sheldrake's book, A New Science of Life, written in 1982. So he changed it to morphic resonance theory later. He changed the name of the book when it came out in reprint. But he has a great, I brought enough for everyone to take a copy. He has a little article here from, I think this is Huffington Post. Why bad science is like bad religion. And he's basically saying we are so entrenched in an idea. He's saying the scientific world is as immobile and delusional as a lot of theocratic structures. And he makes a really compelling case, and I'm just going to read a little bit of it. Bad religion is arrogant, self-righteous, dogmatic, and intolerant, and so is bad science. But unlike religious fundamentalists, scientific fundamentalists do not realize that their opinions are based on faith. They think that they know the truth. They believe that science has already solved the fundamental questions. The details still need working out, but in principle, the answers are known. Science at its best is an open-minded method of inquiry, not a belief system. But the scientific worldview based on the materialistic or mechanical philosophy is enormously prestigious because science has been so successful. Its achievements touch all our lives through technologies like computers, jet planes, cell phones, the internet, modern medicine. Our intellectual world has been transformed through an immense expansion of scientific knowledge, down to the most microscopic particles of matter and out into the vastness of space, with hundreds of billions of galaxies in an ever-expanding universe. Science has been successful because it has been open to new discoveries. By contrast, committed mechanists or materialists have made science into a kind of religion. They believe that there is no reality but material or physical reality. Consciousness is a byproduct of the physical activity of the brain. Matter is unconscious, nature is mechanical, evolution is purposeless. The materialist beliefs are often taken for granted by scientists, not because they have thought about them critically, but because they haven't. To deviate from them is heresy, and heresy harms careers. So I want to invite you to take one of these. Rupert Sheldrake has a well-known TED Talk now called The Banned TED Talk. But I want to invite you to look at his book. It's called The Science Delusion in England, but out here it's called, I think it's the 10, like he basically debunks 10 major beliefs within the sciences. Science Set Free, thank you. Yeah, it's called Science Set Free. And the subtitle references these 10, but it's a really good read. So what happened then to our friend in the video here, James Lovelock, I wanted to just show you another short clip.
For the scientific establishment, Gaia was a mystical vision of organisms acting cooperatively to benefit Mother Earth, fanciful nonsense, which, it was claimed, flew in the face of evolutionary theory.
The first serious criticism from the scientific community was an article by the biologist W. Ford Doolittle entitled, "Is Nature Really Motherly?" in which he took Gaia to the cleaners, or rather the theory.
Doolittle said, well, you'd have to imagine a committee of all of the organisms on the planet getting together every year and deciding what the level of oxygen would be in the atmosphere that year, and obviously that's not going to work.
And they employed really talented writers like Richard Dawkins. And I think at the time, Dawkins hated Gaia as much as he hates God, if you like to make a comparison.
The danger, it's not exactly distressing or disturbing except to an academic biologist who values the truth. The danger is that they will say things like, the function of oxygen is to do so and so, the function of ammonia is, the function of methane is, because it implies that individual organisms that are manufacturing that gas are doing it for the good of the biosphere.
The main thing that Richard Dawkins said was there was no way for living organisms to regulate anything beyond their bodies, what he called their phenotypes. Regulating the planet, the idea of organisms regulating the planet was quite absurd.
The really key objection was, how could Gaia evolve to be self-regulating? You would need that the organisms on the Earth had foresight in some way.
What they saw as altruism on a global scale. They could be altruistic towards themselves or their kin, but that was the limit. Looking after the whole planet and everything on it was just ridiculous. And this is what stuck in the throats of most scientists. They felt that there was no way for Gaia to evolve by natural selection.
So now I'm going to take my leap of faith and share with you some ideas that I just happened upon recently, and I'm going to close with these ideas, and then we'll have a chance to talk together. I am really fascinated with the possibility that matter is self-organizing, and that critical challenges that face matter, and we're matter, by the way, and we're pretty self-organized here. And the theories of life, by the way, are fascinating right now. Stuff that's coming out, Mei-Wan Ho and people like Lynn Margulis are proposing and putting forward ideas about what constitutes a living organism that are fascinating. Eco-philosopher that I love, David Abram, goes so far as to say that ideas are like living organisms, and sometimes they're not meant to be domesticated. They just hover at the periphery of your mind like a deer in a meadow, and the minute you try to capture it, off it goes. So he just has this wonderful way that he tangles with ideas. And I wanted to just share with you an idea that has sort of lingered in my peripheral, and I'll share it with you, and we'll see if it can be tamed or not. But I'm really intrigued with this idea that matter can be self-organizing. And a few examples that I always think about, the mechanist worldview says we are here by a series of incredibly lucky coincidences. And I'll share with you just a handful of them. When the Earth first was molten and forming, all the heavy metals sunk to the core of the Earth. However, our bodies contain, as you know, iron. Do you guys know where the iron in your bodies came from if every single heavy metal sunk to the core of the Earth during its molten period? Where on earth do all the metals on the Earth come from? David? Well, there was a meteor shower that lasted about 30 million years. And it was a massive meteor shower that was caused by a slight shift in Jupiter's orbit. And then a reshift, all the meteors were sucked back out. And so it was as if all the metals were gone, and yet the universe sprinkled a little more metal on the Earth. Another amazing thing that happened was, in order for us to have evolved from our ancestral protozoa, from our ancestral prokaryotes, the single-celled organisms, we needed the Earth to have the capacity for the seas to breathe, for the tides to move in and out. And there was not a moon, but this planetoid struck the Earth with a tremendous amount of force and knocked a chunk of the Earth off. And that chunk went into orbit and stabilized the Earth's orbit and created the circulation of the oceans. Incredibly fortunate moment, right? These things continued to happen. The very first organisms were feeding off of material that was coming up from the seafloor. The ocean was very warm, and this food was rising, right? And these first single-celled organisms, for billions of years, were eating these particular foods that were coming up from the Earth. And all of a sudden, as the Earth cooled, the food started to disappear. So what did the organisms do? There was no food. All life was going to vanish from the earth. One single-celled organism, the first one, what did it do? It captured a photon from the sun and turned it into food. Very creative, right? We have some creative ancestors. And then, through some weird phenomena where these like little fruiting bodies come out, it communicated that process to all the other single-celled organisms, and they all started eating sunlight. Those were the first photosynthesizers. Well, what is a byproduct of photosynthesis?
Carbon dioxide?
Oxygen. So all of a sudden, we started reaching critical oxygen levels in the atmosphere that would basically create a conflagration. One lightning storm, the planet would go up in flames. The oxygen level was getting so concentrated that it was going to destroy the Earth. Then what happened? Then one of these organisms that was metabolizing sunlight just decided to start eating other organisms, because to eat another organism, you need oxygen. So they started to pull the oxygen out of the atmosphere by eating each other. And those are the ancestors of the animals, and those are the ancestors of the plants, by the way, just so you know. But these kind of creative things happen within matter, and it's fascinating to observe. So I'm kind of wondering, what causes this creative organization of matter? You know, we're at this moment right now where the planet is coming unglued, the great unraveling, and across the globe, hundreds of thousands of organizations are springing up, grassroots organizations. Paul Hawken, in a beautiful book called Blessed Unrest, says it's the Earth's autoimmune system. People all over the planet are becoming awake to crises and converting. I mean, I always ask people in a room like this, especially adults, like, are you parenting differently than your parents parented you? Anybody? Raise your hand if you are. It's pretty much across the board. But if you ask your grandparents that, they might say, doing it just like my parents did, which was for generation after generation. But something's shifting pretty quickly. And so, again, we're facing crisis, and matter is self-organizing itself to face crisis. I really believe that. So we align ourselves with these changes, and that's a commitment we make as human beings, or we don't. So the last couple little clips are just relating to this idea, and one in particular is, here's my crazy idea, is that, first I have to show you a couple clips, though. So this clip is called a Chladni plate. If you're from a Waldorf background, you might have heard of one of these.
Matter as we know it. Atoms, stars and galaxies, planets and trees, rocks and us. This matter accounts for less than 5% of the known universe. About 25% is dark matter and 70% dark energy, both of which are invisible. This is kind of strange because it suggests that everything we experience is really only a tiny fraction of reality. But it gets worse. We really have no clue what dark matter and energy are or how they work. We are pretty sure they exist though. So, what do we know? Dark matter is the stuff that makes it possible for galaxies to exist. When we calculated why the universe is structured the way it is, it quickly became clear that there's just not enough normal matter. The gravity of the visible matter is not strong enough to form galaxies and complex structures. Stars would more likely be scattered all over the place and not form galaxies. So we know there is something else inside and around them. Something that doesn't emit or reflect light. Something dark. But besides being able to calculate the existence of dark matter, we can see it, kind of. Places with a high concentration of dark matter bend light passing nearby, so we know there's something there that interacts with gravity. Right now, we have more ideas about what dark energy is not than what it is. We know dark matter is not just clouds of normal matter without stars because it would emit particles we could detect. Dark matter is not antimatter because antimatter produces unique gamma rays when it reacts with normal matter. Dark matter is also not made up of black holes, very compact objects that violently affect their surroundings, while dark matter seems to be scattered all over the place. Basically, we only know three things for sure. 1. Something is out there. 2. It interacts with gravity. 3. There is a lot of it. Dark matter is probably made up of a complicated exotic particle that doesn't interact with light and matter in a way we expect, but right now, we just don't know.
I was reading a lot about dark matter, dark energy, and there's some really interesting new theories about it. And all the scientists are trying to measure it and find it. And this one couple of Harvard scientists, if that has any credibility, they're basically suggesting that it is not even in this universe in the way that we would imagine it to be. So they're trying to really stretch the way they think about it, that it's like almost, and they're basing this on some stuff they're seeing in the core of our particular galaxy. But what we do know is that dark matter is everywhere. It's in this room. Dark energy and dark matter are everywhere. And the idea that struck me was, just like the sound vibrations are organizing the salt on that, the matter on that Chladni plate, it's called, maybe dark matter is somehow implicated in the self-organizing properties of matter as we understand them based on systems theory. It's just a thought, because it does represent 95% of what's out there. Yes, Uzi.
It's funny, I was going to say the same thing. So just
Cool.
the same thing, because there are some people that claim that gravity is just an instance of very high frequency. And just taking that a little further, it could be that dark matter is just, even higher frequency that creates other gravities that we don't understand, and that self-organizes the universe as we see in clusters and galaxies.
It's exciting work that is, I really believe it's at the forefront of modern science. These kinds of things are not fringe and whack ideas. They are being struggled with on the deepest levels by people in systems theory and in the new science and in chaos theory and in quantum physics. And it's work that actually can begin to help us understand our own personal experience. And that experience I hope to illustrate in the last two short clips, and then I'm done. And the first clip is a native Australian Aborigine talking about his connection to the land. And the video is entitled, "The Land Owns Us."
Yeah, we're here at Mutijula, right beside Uluru, the home of my ancestors. And it was in that area there called Tempe Downs where I came out. And that's why the police were brought in. And that's how I was taken, at that time by a police officer into Alice Spring. Like so many kids who then now referred to as the stolen generation. But of course, bush living was bush. You totally took most of your things from the land you're on. We just lived on the land as people of the land. To us, it was a natural way of being. Being part of all that there is was just the way you was. You didn't see anything any different from you. It was just a way of life that was inclusive of all that there is through life. Life is the binding and the connecting way the oneness is. If you're alive, you connect to everything else that is alive. But that oneness included everything that was around us, and you was raised with that teachings from a child upwards. You know, the relationship, and our relationship system for our people here. See, my people see land ownership as being totally different to the English way of ownership, because ours used to be, really, the land owns us, and it still is that to us. You know, the land grows all of us up, and it really does. You know, no human is older than the land itself. It just isn't. And no living marsupial is as old as the land itself. Everything that's been and gone with life in the flesh has died. But the land is still here. Part of land which has been handed down to you by your ancestors, we say the granny law, has given me my responsibility now that I'm grown up to care for my country, care for my mother, care for everything that is around me, the oneness, the completeness of that oneness, to be responsible in both caring, in every single way, which we call the kanyini, caring with unconditional love, with the responsibility. You feel that so well, that you feel good when you're in that space, and you kind of feel you're living with family when you include everything that is alive in that space, and that it's a huge space, and there's a lot of specimens of everything you could possibly imagine there with you. And then you grow up knowing that these are all your family. You can never feel lonely in that situation. You know, you just can't. How can you when all around you is family members, from this ground up to all the trees around you, to the clouds hanging up around you, the birds flying by, the animals and reptiles that are just hidden in the shrub there for now, but can come out if they want to, hunt around for their little food, and then they can become food for us as well. It is a beautiful way of being. It doesn't push anyone out, but it brings everybody in. And the completeness of being who you are, where you are, is a really good feeling. And it's a beautiful feeling. I wouldn't exchange it for anything. That's why I'm here, right beside Uluru. I am so lucky.
secret is, I'm going to tell you, what I'm trying to do at Manzanita is I'm trying to have kids feel about the earth the way that old Aboriginal man did, and then to understand through systems why they feel that way, and then to study the Great Turning to know that they can do something about it. So that's the secret of Words Out now, right? Martine's giving me a thumbs up over there. So now you all know. Anyway, that's the end of my presentation. There's like 3.5 minutes for questions, so thank you guys.